This is our final video, okay? The only thing left to talk about is revision, all right? How we're going to take our drafts and turn them into more fully conceived, finished pieces of art, okay? Your portfolios are due on Friday, okay, of course, and by this time you've already watched the portfolio video, I hope, right, and read the rubrics and guidelines regarding the portfolio. You have a clear sense of what's expected of you. If not, please do that right now, okay, before continuing. It's important that we're all kind of on the same page regarding what I'm looking for out of the portfolio, okay? Just a quick review. 4 revised poems, right? A reflective essay, 2-page double-spaced, okay? And the online journal response, 1-page double-spaced, and the poetry reading response, 1-page double-spaced. Okay, so those 4 components, all in one document, please, and submitted on Blackboard by 11:59 on Friday. Okay, and that'll be it. Great. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm looking for out of revisions, and a little bit about the kind of practice of revision, because it's a huge part of what writing is. You know, as I'm sure you already know from your from the fiction 4 weeks, right? Revision holds the same weight for poetry. It truly does for all kinds of writing, right? Even if you're writing a piece for the newspaper, right? Revision is writing to a certain extent, right? That old saw about, you know, writing is 10% inspiration, you know, 90% revision, perspiration, whatever, you know. That's true, you know. I mean, the seed of a poem might happen in a moment, right? It might happen when you're sitting on the bus or you're cutting your lawn or something like that, right? But then what actually eventuates the poem, right? What actually pulls into being the poem itself happens only through the practice of revision, right? So the revisions I'm looking for from you for Friday should be substantial, okay? And by that I mean I really want you to kind of reopen the poems, readdress the issues in the poems, and to kind of fully engage with the poems once again, right? And I make this point only because it's kind of difficult sometimes to do this, right? You know, you'll write a poem, you'll spend an hour or two in the zone, right, in the emotional space of the poem, right? And then when it's done, when you finish that draft, you kind of step out of it, and sometimes it's hard to get back in, right? So, you know, whatever you can do when you're revising these poems to kind of remind yourself, really, of what the poem is doing, what your hopes for the poem were, what specific emotions the poem is drawing on, right? That will all help you kind of reevaluate the poem on its own terms, right? So kind of get back into the headspace of each poem, right, before revising. The practice of revision, right, involves really kind of 2 different forms of approach, right? And I've called these the local approach and the global approach, right? These aren't necessarily my terms. These are you know, kind of creative writing or writing pedagogical terms about revision. Okay. Local revisions consist of small, you know, not small is a bad word because they can be very important, right? But typically, sort of revisions that do not alter the main structure of the poem. Okay, so for instance, some of the comments that I left in your poems, like, "Hey, this is too abstract here. Can you provide an image?" Or, you know, "This is kind of a weak adjective. Can you give me some more fresh, unusual language?" Those kinds of things, right? Or, "I don't love the beginning here. Can you find a new beginning?" Or, "I don't love the ending. Can you find a new ending?" Those kinds of things that aren't going to alter the entire poem itself, right? The entire structure and being of the poem, but are nevertheless going to turn into a much stronger piece. Those are local revisions, okay? And so to locally revise, what you really have to do is just kind of keep reevaluating the poems many, many times, right? Of course, we don't have a ton of time ourselves, right? So the key here is going to be kind of reading over the poems many times for small periods of time. Okay, so for instance, you know, today, after finishing this video, go over your poems, look at those little local comments that I made and some of the comments that your peers made, and some of the things that you just don't feel quite happy about the poem, and see if anything strikes you, right? You know, you know that you need an image here. Well, is an image on the top of my mind right now. I can't really think of it. That's okay. I'll go to the next poem, right? And then 2 hours later, look back at the poems again and breeze through them one more time, right? And see if anything kind of rises to the surface. And then right before bed, take another look at the poems and see, well, okay, now I've got an image for this. Now, and by doing that, they'll just kind of always be present in your consciousness throughout the day, right? And things will be kind of percolating. It's kind of magical how this happens. One of my teachers, Marianne Baruch, who I sent the email with the video of, she calls this doing hospital rounds on the poems, right? Doing hospital rounds on your poems, and simply, kind of reevaluating them every couple hours or every day, just to make sure that they're at the top of your mind, and that that you're allowing certain images to kind of come out, right? So that's the best practice for local revisions, right? Local revisions also typically concern kind of smaller formal changes, right? So line breaks, right? Stanza breaks. Hey, and I'm gonna shorten my line lengths here. I'm gonna lengthen my line lengths here. I need to find a better rhyme for this word, etc. Those kinds of things are local revisions. Very important, but they're not altering the structure of the poem. So you'll certainly have those to do. But you also may have, depending on the poems you're revising, you may have some global revisions to undertake. And these are revisions that are actually kind of reimagining the entire poem, okay? That are changing the underlying structure of a poem. And oftentimes, probably most often, this involves first a lot of cutting, right? Something about the poem is just not working, but I know that there are a couple things that I like in the poem, so I'm going to start with those things. I'm going to cut away everything else. I'm going to just chop it up and pare it down to just those things that I like, and use that as another starting place. Or perhaps that's your ending place. If you have a longer poem and you chop it up, and then maybe, hey, you find that your poem is actually in there already, but you just kind of needed to trim away a lot of the excess. Sort of like a sculptor will carve something out of a block of marble, right? You chip it all away, and then you find your finely tuned figure at the end of it. That's possible, right? But in any case, cutting is extraordinarily important, right? And it's difficult because it's hard for us to part with those things that we like, right? That language that we like. Even if we don't really like it, we have a sense that it's ours, and somehow it hurts to cut it away. But you kind of have to put that aside. You have to be ruthless with your own poems, right? And keep in mind that just because you're cutting something doesn't mean that it's bad in any sense, right? It just means that it's not right for the poem at this particular moment, right? And anything that is not helping the poem is hurting it, okay? Or a poem should be sort of weightless, right? And any excess is going to kind of weigh it down, all right? So a lot of cutting, right? Be ruthless with your poems. Cut it down to what is most essential, right? The other form of global revision that will change the underlying structure of the poem is expansion. And in many cases on your poems, I may have said, hey, can you expand on this image? Or can you expand the ending? Can you write past the ending, right? And this is going to require actually sort of new drafting, right? You have to kind of re-enter the space of the poem, as I said, and just kind of keep going, right? See what other associations your mind is going to lead you to, what other images you can find, etc. Okay? Oftentimes this happens at the end of the poem, right? I'll ask you to kind of, keep going. Hey, you haven't quite got to that insight that you need, but sometimes this consists of actually finding the insight already in the draft, right? So maybe you wrote your first poem, right? Your first draft of a poem, and the ending is really good. The last line is just really good. You feel like you've found some interesting language, and you're saying something interesting in very concrete detail. And it kind of took the rest of the poem. It kind of took the entire poem for you to get there. But now that you're there, you can kind of throw away everything else because really what you wanted was that piece. So then, in the new global revision, right? In the expansion of the poem, you take that one final line and you move it up to the top, and you use it as a beginning line, and then you expand from that, and you see where else you can find, where else you can go, excuse me. Okay, so that's another kind of method of global revision. Not necessarily cutting down, but expanding, right? Seeing what other associations you can find. And oftentimes, you want to pay attention, and again, we're going to harken back to the video on the sonnet. You want to pay attention to where the turns in the poem might be. Where can I turn the poem? Where can I pivot here and introduce something new or go somewhere else. That's very exciting in a poem, right? That's where we get that good surprise and the good ambiguity is when we have those turns, those pivots. And so oftentimes an expansion will consist of doing simply that, of simply finding some place in the poem where I can pivot. Right? Sometimes this is referred to as a trapdoor in the poem. Where in the poem can I just kind of like drop out through a trapdoor and go somewhere else? You know, that's really exciting. So look for those places in revisions, especially for those poems where you sense you need to do a global revision, and see where you can go that is wild and exciting and new. Right? Someplace you did not expect, and thus the reader did not expect to go. Okay? So those are the two basic forms of global revision: condensing by cutting, or expanding by more growth of the poem, right? So the key here is though that you really have to kind of reopen yourself to the poem again, and find really what is going to work for you in terms of revision, right? Some people are those kinds of writers that you know, they like to work a long time on getting one draft together, and then most of their revisions consist of local revisions, right? But then there are those other writers who maybe will kind of spit out a draft in 15 minutes maybe, you know, and then the vast majority of their work consists of kind of globally reimagining what you have, and figuring out, well, what is useful in this poem, what image have I found that I like, and then kind of going somewhere else with it, all right? So in practical terms, what I'd like you to do is to, of course, read the Mary Oliver essay on revision, okay? Then practice a little bit with your poems, okay? I'm going to ask you to submit 3 different drafts of one of your poems for an assignment today, okay? So the original draft plus 2 other revisions that you've done, right? And so in doing that, try and see if you can't provide me with 2 revisions that are kind of different, that are kind of wildly different in some sense. One that maybe operates by a kind of local revision, that kind of tightening and introducing of different images and strengthening of the language, and then one that really just goes somewhere else, you know, a global revision that kind of takes you somewhere else, and then see which one you like, right? And I'm willing to bet that, you know, 7 times out of 10, it'll be the global revision. That kind of strikes you as the more interesting take, right? So experiment a little bit today. And of course, I haven't really said much about my own comments and the comments of your peers, right? You want to take those into account, of course, when you're doing your revisions. At the end of the day, though, this is your poem, and so you kind of have to figure out what is going to work for you, what is going to be the strongest method of revision for your own ends. Okay, so please email me questions, right? If you even if we haven't had a chance to do a one-on-one conference and you just feel like, you know, there's one poem that you kind of want to run a couple lines by me or something like that, you know, or you say, I think this is a good image, but you know, I'm not sure of its effect. Send me an email, write it out, include the draft as an attachment or something like that, and I'll respond as quickly as I can. Okay, great guys. I very much look forward to reading these revisions in your portfolio. I can't wait. Okay, good luck.